Victor Willis died on Tuesday, June 30th, 2026, at the age of 74. To most of the world, he was the cop, the one in the tight blue uniform, the aviator sunglasses, the mustache, dancing next to a cowboy and a construction worker and a man dressed as a Native American chief. But the truth about Victor Willis, the man who wrote YMCA, is a lot bigger than a costume, and it took him almost 50 years, and a legal fight most of his fans never heard about, to get people to understand who he actually was. He wasn't just the man who sang YMCA, he was the man who wrote it, and for a long stretch of his life, the industry that made millions off those 4 letters tried to pretend that wasn't true. Victor Edward Willis was born on July 1, 1951 in Dallas, Texas, and grew up in San Francisco. His father was a Baptist preacher, and Willis got his voice the way a lot of great soul singers got theirs, standing in a church choir on Sunday mornings, singing gospel under his father's roof. That voice, deep and full and built for a room without a microphone, would end up carrying one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. But before any of that, Willis went the theater route. He trained in acting and dance, moved to New York, joined the Negro Ensemble Company, and by 1976 he was appearing in the original Broadway production of The Wiz. He was a working actor and singer with a soul background, doing 8 shows a week, when his life took a hard left turn into disco history. In 1977, a French record producer named Jacques Morali was putting together a new act, something built around the exaggerated, hyper-masculine imagery you'd see in gay clubs in New York's Greenwich Village. The idea reportedly came to Morali and his business partner Henri Bilolo while they were out at an after-hours club in the West Village watching the crowd and talking about the kind of larger-than-life characters that filled the room. Morali didn't have a band yet. He had a concept, a name, and an idea. He needed a voice. An arranger who'd worked with Willis suggested him, and Morali made him a pitch that sounded more like a fantasy than a business deal. He told Willis he'd had a dream that Willis sang lead on an album he produced and that it became a massive hit. He told him he couldn't pay much up front, but if Willis said yes, he'd make him a star. Willis said yes. And because the actual band didn't exist yet as anything more than a concept, Willis recorded the first Village People songs essentially alone, backed by session singers, while the group's image was still being assembled around him. The cover photograph for that debut album didn't even feature the real singer, it featured male models, since Willis's Broadway commitments kept him from making the shoot. The album came out in 1977, built around songs steeped in gay nightlife culture, even though the touring lineup performing them didn't exist yet. Casablanca Records, the label run by Neil Bogart that had already turned Donna Summer into a disco superstar, picked up Village People for wider distribution, placing them in the same commercial orbit as the biggest names in the genre. Once the record started to catch on, the producers needed an actual group to put in front of cameras. After an early appearance on American Bandstand with a rougher, unpolished lineup, Can't Stop Productions ran a now-famous recruitment ad in the trade papers looking for what it called macho types, men who could dance and had a mustache. Out of that casting search came the classic lineup: a cowboy, a construction worker, a biker, a sailor, a Native American, and a police officer. That cop, and later a naval officer, was Willis. It became his signature role, the character he'd be identified with for the rest of his life. But it's worth saying plainly, the costume was a costume. The voice, and a huge amount of the songwriting, belonged to one specific person underneath it. 1978 was the year everything changed. Village People released 2 albums, Macho Man and Cruisin', and it was Cruisin' that carried the song that would outlive the disco era, outlive the group's original lineup, and eventually outlive Willis himself. YMCA peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. At the same moment, Giorgio Moroder was redefining what a dance record could sound like from his Munich studios, and Donna Summer was selling out arenas. Village People were operating at the very top of that world. A year later came Go West, home to another massive hit, In the Navy. Willis didn't just sing these songs, he co-wrote them, working out the lyrics alongside Morali, turning a producer's concept album into something people all over the world could sing along to without even knowing the words in their own language. Here's the part most casual fans never think about. When you hear YMCA at a wedding, a ball game, or a bar at last call, you're hearing lyrics that came out of Victor Willis's own life. He's talked about this many times over the years, pushing back hard against a version of the song's origin story that took hold in pop culture and never let go. The popular assumption became that the song was written as a coded anthem for the gay community, partly because Morali was gay, partly because some of the group's members were gay, and partly because the YMCA itself had a reputation in certain cities as a meeting spot for gay men. Willis has always rejected that reading of his own lyrics. According to him, the song came out of a much simpler place. He grew up going to Y branches in the urban parts of San Francisco, and he wrote about what he actually knew: the swimming, the basketball courts, the track, the cheap rooms and cheap food that made the Y a lifeline for young men without much money. When the lyrics talk about hanging out with the boys, Willis has said that phrase was nothing more than 1970s black slang for guys spending time together over sports or a card game. He didn't deny that the song got adopted by the gay community as an anthem over the decades, and he said more than once that he didn't mind that at all. What he objected to was journalists treating that adoption as proof of authorial intent, as if the meaning belonged to everyone except the man who actually sat down and wrote the words. That tension between what Willis actually wrote and what the world decided the song meant followed him for his entire life, and it got dramatically more public and more expensive once a certain former president started using the song at his rallies. But we'll come back to that. By 1980, cracks had already formed. Willis left Village People at the height of their commercial success, right as the group prepared to make the feature film Can't Stop the Music. He wasn't in the movie, though he still contributed lyrics to two of its songs, Magic Night and Milkshake. The film flopped, and without Willis's voice out front, Village People never landed another hit on the scale of YMCA or In the Navy. Morali talked him into one more try in 1982 for an album called Fox on the Box, but Willis left again shortly after it came out. A different singer, Ray Simpson, stepped into the cop role and toured with a version of the group for decades. To a huge percentage of people who caught the band live anytime after 1980, Village People simply meant whoever happened to be wearing the uniforms that night. The man who'd actually created the character and written a huge share of the songs quietly disappeared from the story. By most accounts, Willis spent this stretch refusing offers to record or perform the very songs he'd co-written, unwilling to be part of a machine that had moved on without him. The years that followed weren't easy. Willis struggled with substance abuse, and in 2007 he entered treatment at the Betty Ford Clinic. He'd recorded a solo album back in 1979, Solo Man, that sat unreleased for more than 30 years before it finally came out in 2010. That same year, he started appearing at Major League Baseball games to sing the national anthem, a small but telling sign that he was working his way back into public life. For most of that decade, though, Willis wasn't performing the songs he'd helped write. He'd walked away from the group and, by most accounts, from the business side of his own legacy too. Then, starting around 2011, Victor Willis did something that changed not just his own life but reshaped how the entire music industry thinks about old contracts. Back in the late 1970s, when Willis signed over his share of the copyrights on songs like YMCA, In the Navy, and Go West to the production company Can't Stop Productions and its French affiliate Scorpio Music, he had almost no leverage. He was a young performer being handed a contract by producers who already controlled the machine around him. In exchange for signing away those rights, he was set up to receive royalty percentages that ranged from around 12 to 20%, depending on the song, while the publishers held onto the bulk of the ownership. But buried inside U.S. copyright law was a provision most songwriters from that era didn't fully understand yet. Under Section 203 of the Copyright Act of 1976, sometimes cited as 17 U.S.C. Sax 203, an author who transferred away the rights to their work could terminate that transfer and reclaim it, but only after waiting 35 years and only by filing formal legal notice within a specific window. For songs signed away in the late 1970s, that window opened up starting in 2013. It was quite literally a ticking clock built into the law, and very few artists from the disco era had begun testing it in court. In January of 2011, with 2 years of advance notice required by law, Victor Willis filed to terminate his 1977 transfer of 33 songs, YMCA among them. Scorpio Music and Can't Stop Productions didn't just let it happen. They sued him first, asking a federal court in California to rule that Willis had no right to take his songs back at all. Their argument came in 2 parts. First, they claimed that because Willis was only one of at least 3 credited co-writers on many of these songs, he couldn't terminate his share alone, that it would take a majority of all the credited authors agreeing together to pull the rights back. Second, they argued that even if Willis could terminate, he should only be allowed to reclaim the same narrow royalty percentage he'd originally been paid, somewhere between 12 and 20%, nothing more. In May of 2012, federal judge Barry Ted Moskowitz ruled against the publishers on both counts. The court found that when joint authors sign away their rights through separate individual agreements rather than one shared contract, each of them has the standalone power to terminate his own piece of that grant. Willis didn't need permission from his co-writers. He'd signed his rights away on his own, and the law said he could take them back the same way. On the second question, the court was just as direct. Willis wasn't limited to the small royalty cut he'd been living on for over 30 years. Termination meant he got back exactly what he'd handed over in the first place, which on a song like YMCA meant a full 1/3 ownership interest as one of 3 credited writers. It didn't stop there. Willis went further, arguing in a later phase of the case that one of the 3 names on the official copyright registration for several of these songs hadn't actually contributed to writing them, and that the real authorship belonged to just 2 people, himself and Morali. If a court agreed with that claim, Willis wouldn't just be entitled to a 1/3 share, he'd be entitled to half. That fight played out over the following months, but the outcome for Willis was substantial. His ownership share on key songs, including the one that made the group famous, moved from around 1/3 up toward a full half. Willis wasn't operating in a vacuum. Across the music business, that same 2013 termination window was starting to loom over decades of old contracts. Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Tom Waits were among the prominent names filing their own Section 203 termination notices around the same period, each trying to claw back rights they'd signed away early in their careers, long before anyone could have predicted what those songs would eventually be worth. Publishers and record labels, understandably, were not thrilled about a law that let creators reopen deals that were supposed to be permanent. Willis's case, decided by Judge Moskowitz, became one of the first to actually reach a courtroom and produce a written decision, which meant lawyers on both sides of the industry were reading it closely, looking for a roadmap for what was coming next. The publishers didn't let the 50% question go quietly. They tried to get Willis's counterclaim thrown out entirely, arguing he'd waited too long to challenge the original authorship credits and that the standard 3-year statute of limitations on ownership disputes had already expired. The court disagreed, ruling that the clock on that kind of claim only starts once a songwriter is clearly and directly told his ownership is being denied, not simply from the date he originally signed a contract. That ruling mattered far beyond Willis's own case. It meant that older songwriters who'd quietly accepted unfair authorship splits decades earlier without ever formally objecting weren't necessarily barred from fighting for a fairer share once termination rights kicked in. Legal analysts at the time called the case one of the first and most closely watched tests of the 2013 termination window, a preview of what was coming for a whole generation of songwriters, from disco to rock to folk, who'd signed away their rights decades earlier without ever imagining they'd get a second chance. For Victor Willis, it wasn't theoretical. It was his life's work, finally coming back into his own hands. Winning back the copyrights was one battle. Getting his band back was another. By the 2010s, Village People as a touring act had continued for decades without him, built around Ray Simpson and other members who'd joined long after Willis left. But Can't Stop Productions still controlled something Willis's copyright win hadn't touched directly, the trademark, the name, and the licensing rights to put a group called Village People on stage. With his wife, entertainment attorney Karen Huff Willis, pushing the legal strategy, Willis leveraged his newly reclaimed songwriting stake into a broader negotiation. In 2017, he reached a settlement with Henry Bilolo, Morales' surviving production partner. As part of that deal, the license held by the version of Village People that had been touring without Willis was terminated, and a company controlled by Victor and Karen Willis was granted the rights to license the name going forward. After nearly 40 years, the man who'd helped invent the character walked back out on stage as the actual, legally recognized lead singer of Village People for the first time since 1980. It's worth sitting with how unusual that is in the music industry. Plenty of legacy acts fight over royalties. It's much rarer for a founding member to lose his band entirely, disappear from the story for decades, and then legally reclaim both the songs and the name itself. Willis didn't just win a lawsuit, he took his group back. Once he was back at the front of Village People, the institutional recognition started catching up to him too. In March of 2020, the Library of Congress selected YMCA for preservation in the National Recording Registry, officially designating it a piece of American cultural history. A year later, the song was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2018, the reunited group released A Village People Christmas, and Willis kept touring with the band he'd helped invent 40 years earlier, this time as its rightful owner rather than a hired voice replaced without a phone call. The final chapter of Willis's public life turned out to be the strangest one, and it circled right back to the questions people had been asking about YMCA for years. Starting in the run-up to Donald Trump's 2020 presidential campaign, the song became a fixture at his rallies, with Trump dancing to it at the end of nearly every event. It joined a long, uncomfortable list of artists objecting to their music being used at those rallies, alongside acts like Rihanna, Adele, the Rolling Stones, and Queen. Village People initially gave a cautious, reluctant blessing, telling fans in a public statement that the president had remained respectful in his use of their songs and hadn't, in their words, crossed the line. That approval didn't last. In the summer of 2020, in the wake of the administration's response to the Black Lives Matter protests, the group reversed course, and Willis personally asked that YMCA and Macho Man be pulled from the rallies, saying he could no longer look the other way. By the time Trump ran again in 2024, Willis's position had shifted. He said he didn't have the heart to block a fan who genuinely seemed to enjoy the song, at a moment when several other major artists were publicly demanding Trump stop using their music. He let it keep playing. And according to Willis, the financial upside was massive. He said the song had been stuck at number 2 on a Billboard chart for over 45 years, and that Trump's continued use finally pushed it to number 1, where it held for 2 weeks. Willis said the exposure translated into serious money for him personally, on top of the ownership stake he'd already fought years in court to win back. That renewed spotlight reignited the old argument about what the song actually meant, and this time Willis didn't let it go quietly. In a lengthy public statement in December of 2024, he laid out in detail why he considered the gay anthem label a false assumption, tracing it back to his writing partner's identity and the makeup of the group rather than anything in his actual lyrics. He said the song was written about swimming, basketball, cheap rooms, and cheap food at the Y branches he knew from San Francisco, and that the phrase about hanging out with the boys was plain 1970s slang, nothing more. He even said he didn't mind the LGBTQ community treating YMCA as an unofficial anthem of their own. What frustrated him was media outlets stating it as settled fact that the lyrics carried a coded message he never intended, and he went so far as to say his wife, as his attorney, planned to pursue legal action against outlets that kept repeating the claim as though it were established truth about his own writing. It's a strange kind of vindication. Victor Willis spent his whole career being handed a persona by other people, a costume, a character, a myth about what his most famous song secretly meant. And in the final years of his life, he fought in court and in public to take authorship back on every level, legal ownership of the songs under Section 203, control of the band's name, and the actual stated meaning of the words he wrote as a young man in the 1970s. He died a co-owner of the songs that made him famous, the recognized lead singer of the band that had once replaced him without so much as a phone call, and a man who right up until the end was still correcting the record on what YMCA was actually about. Village People announced his death on Tuesday, June 30th, 2026, saying he'd passed after what they called a short but aggressive illness and asking for privacy. His wife, Karen Huff Willis, shared a similar statement, calling it a profound loss. Tributes came in from across the industry, along with a public statement from President Trump himself, who called Willis a great and happy guy and said he'd think of him every time YMCA gets played. That song has been played at this point more times than almost anyone can count. Weddings, ball games, birthday parties, political rallies, high school gyms, 4 letters and a hand gesture recognized on nearly every continent on Earth, one of fewer than 40 singles in history to sell more than 10 million physical copies. For most of pop culture history, the man who actually wrote those words was treated as an afterthought behind the costume, a cop suit that any singer could apparently step into. That was never true, and Victor Willis spent the back half of his life proving it in the only language the industry actually respects: contracts, courtrooms, and trademarks. He didn't just win his royalties back, he won the argument. By the time Village People announced his passing, nobody serious in the music business could tell the story of YMCA without Victor Willis's name attached to it, front and center, exactly where it belonged from the start. He wasn't just the cop in the video, he was the voice, the writer, and by the end, the rightful owner of one of the most famous songs in American history.